10-year-old David Logan stood on the Andersons' porch, knuckles white against the wooden railing as he wrestled with whether to knock. He had run away from his foster mother, Jennifer Wilson, who lived just across the street, but he wasn't certain the Andersons would welcome him unannounced. Summoning courage, he raised his hand and rapped quietly. Mrs. Anderson opened the door, her eyes immediately landing on David's trembling frame. "David?" she asked, soft concern coloring her voice. "What brings you here at this hour?" David swallowed hard, glancing at his own scuffed sneakers. "I?" He paused, unable to meet her gaze. "I was wondering if you could adopt me," he said, words tumbling out in a rush. Though he'd rehearsed what to say in his head, actually voicing it sent a fresh wave of fear coursing through his body. Mrs. Anderson's expression shifted from mild confusion to alarm. She beckoned him inside, shutting the door gently behind them. Her husband, John Anderson, emerged from the kitchen, wiping his hands on a dish towel. One look at David's tear-streaked face, and John's shoulders tensed. "You're scaring us, David," Mrs. Anderson said softly. "Are you hurt? Did something happen?" David shook his head, but couldn't stop his tears. I don't feel safe at Miss Wilson's anymore," he managed, voice quivering. A hush fell between them. The Andersons knew that David was in foster care, but they had never expected him to show up at their door, pleading for help. Across the street, voices carried on the wind, Jennifer Wilson calling David's name. Mrs. Anderson peeked out the window to see Wilson, a broad figure with a commanding presence, stomping up and down the sidewalk, shouting. The tension in her voice made the hairs on Mrs. Anderson's neck stand on end. She shot her husband a worried look. John nodded gravely. "Stay here," he instructed David before stepping outside. Mrs. Anderson stayed with the boy, her arm around his shoulders. "We're here for you," she promised. Outside, John calmly approached Wilson, who demanded to know if David was inside. "He's terrified," John said flatly. "You need to slow down and explain what's going on." Wilson's frustration was evident. Her voice rose. "He ran off after throwing a fit. He does this for attention," she insisted, pacing the length of the Andersons' driveway. "That boy exaggerates everything." John stood his ground. "He says he's not safe. We can't just ignore that." Before Wilson could reply, a figure emerged from a nearby patrol car. Detective Mark Harris, having been dispatched by a concerned neighbor's call, walked up with measured steps. The tension was palpable. David inside, Wilson fuming outside, and the Andersons caught in the middle. Harris asked for a quick rundown. John explained that David had shown up at their doorstep, claiming fear of Wilson's harsh punishments. Wilson bristled, calling it all an overreaction. "He's my foster son," she snapped, "and he's acting out like usual." Harris listened intently, eyes flicking between John, Wilson, and the lit window where Mrs. Anderson sheltered David. "I'd like to speak to David myself," he said finally, voice firm but calm. John nodded, motioning for Harris to head inside. As Wilson followed, the detective gently stopped her. "One moment, Mrs. Wilson. Why don't we talk separately first?" The group shuffled awkwardly, tension simmering. David, peering around the living room corner, locked eyes with Harris, seeking a glimmer of hope. It was in that fragile moment that the seeds of a deeper, more disturbing truth began to take root. Detective Mark Harris walked into the Andersons' living room, where Mrs. Anderson was rubbing David's back, trying to calm him. The young boy looked up at Harris, eyes puffy and red. Outside, John Anderson could be heard speaking to Jennifer Wilson, whose agitated voice fell in the background. "I just need to ask a few questions," Harris said softly, pulling up a chair so he could sit at eye level with David. "Are you hurt right now?" David blinked, then shook his head. "Not right now," he murmured, "but it's not safe with her. She punishes me when I do something wrong." Mrs. Anderson swallowed hard, giving the boy a moment to elaborate. "It's okay," she coaxed gently. "Tell him what you told us." David inhaled shakily. "She sits on me, or she pins me down," he said, voice trembling. "Sometimes I can't breathe. I try to get away, but she's stronger. I thought maybe if I asked you—" He looked up at Mrs. Anderson, eyes pleading. "You'd let me live here." Harris nodded, concern etched on his face. Before he could respond, Jennifer Wilson stormed inside, John close behind. "This is ridiculous," Wilson announced, voice taut with anger. He's lying, trying to get attention. Harris stood, holding up a hand. Mrs. Wilson, please. I'm Detective Harris. We got a call from a neighbor about a disturbance. I need everyone to stay calm so we can figure out what's really going on. Wilson snorted. I've known David for months. He always overreacts. There's no abuse. He just hates rules. In that instant, Harris's phone buzzed. He glanced down, reading a text from a fellow officer who'd arrived outside. It mentioned possible doorbell footage captured by the Andersons' neighbor, something that might show a confrontation earlier in the day. Excuse me, Harris said, stepping aside to take the call. An uneasy quiet settled among the group. Wilson paced near the couch, shooting glares at David, who looked as if he might shrink into Mrs. Anderson's embrace. John Anderson clenched his fists, not daring to speak lest he worsen the standoff. Moments later, Harris returned, expression darker. I need to see that footage. It might clarify some things. Mrs. Anderson nodded hesitantly. Our neighbor across the street has a doorbell camera that catches part of the sidewalk. Maybe David ran by there earlier. Wilson sneered. Go ahead and look. You'll see he's making this up. But her voice betrayed a flicker of unease. As if on cue, a uniformed officer knocked on the door, tablet in hand. Harris stepped over to speak with him quietly. A clip began playing. The screen showed a fuzzy image of David hurrying away from Wilson's house, then Wilson striding after him. While the footage didn't capture a full assault, there was a moment where David stumbled and Wilson appeared to press him down briefly. Harris exhaled, lips set in a grim line. Mrs. Wilson, this doesn't look good, he said, turning back to her. She opened her mouth to protest, but the resignation in her eyes said she knew this was damning. David clung to Mrs. Anderson, tears sliding down his cheeks. See? He whispered. She does that kind of stuff all the time. The detective nodded. We'll need to follow proper protocol here, but based on this footage and David's statements, I'm inclined to take this very seriously. He exchanged a look with John Anderson, who nodded in silent agreement. The wheels of an official investigation had just begun turning, and none of them could ignore where it might lead. Detective Harris left shortly after reviewing the doorbell footage, promising to open a formal case. He advised the Andersons to keep David with them for the night if they were comfortable, at least until Child Protective Services, CPS, could intervene. Jennifer Wilson left in a huff, muttering about overzealous cops and neighbors minding their own business. That evening, as the Andersons tried to settle David into their guest room, he clung to Mrs. Anderson's arm. What if she comes back? He whispered. She's going to be so mad, I told. Mrs. Anderson assured him he was safe there. We'll lock the doors, she promised. Detective Harris is keeping an eye on the situation. Still, when night fell, David struggled to sleep. He woke up around midnight, sweaty and shaking, after a vivid nightmare where Wilson pinned him to the floor, laughing as he gasped for air. Mrs. Anderson found him sitting on the edge of the bed, eyes wide with terror. Shh! It's okay, she soothed, offering him a glass of water. You're with us now. The next morning, Harris phoned to confirm details for a protective order. He also planned to reach out to CPS. David might need a medical exam, he advised over speakerphone. Even if there are no visible injuries right now, we need proper documentation. John offered to drive David to a small clinic not far from their neighborhood. David sat in the waiting area, knees bouncing nervously. A nurse eventually called him in, and after a brief checkup, the doctor noted bruises on David's arms and lower back. Could be from rough handling, the doctor said quietly, eyeing David with concern. I'll file my report. Meanwhile, Jennifer Wilson was nowhere to be found. Harris had tried calling her, but each attempt went to voicemail. He drove by her house twice, lights off, curtains drawn, no sign of movement. A neighbor mentioned seeing Wilson leave the night before, a suitcase in hand. Back at the Andersons' home, Mrs. Anderson tried to keep David occupied with board games and TV, but the boy would flinch whenever a car passed by, half expecting Wilson to barge in. She won't just let me go, David told Mrs. Anderson, voice trembling with a knowledge far too heavy for his 10 years. When Harris arrived in the afternoon with a CPS worker, they discussed safety measures. The CPS representative, a woman named Miss Alvarez, gently explained to David that steps were being taken to keep him from returning to Wilson's care. David exhaled in relief, but the tension in his eyes never fully subsided. At dusk, John stepped outside to take in the cool air and spotted a figure at the end of the street. He squinted, but the person melted into the shadows before he could confirm an identity. Unease rippled through him. Perhaps Wilson had returned, watching from a distance. Harris, still inside, took a call and excused himself. He said a single neighbor's doorbell camera might not be the only footage. Another resident a block away might have caught something on a security system. The detective's eyes glinted with determination as he walked out, phone at his ear. David watched him go, uncertain. Part of him yearned for final assurance that Wilson couldn't hurt him anymore. But deep down, he sensed that the most dangerous chapters of his story were yet to unfold. David spent a restless night under the Andersons' roof. By morning, the tension in the house was palpable. Mrs. Anderson was on the phone with Miss Alvarez from CPS, who was working to secure an emergency placement for David. John flipped through the local news channels, worried that Wilson might try something drastic. Around mid-morning, the front door swung open without warning. Jennifer Wilson stood there, face flushed, eyes stormy with emotion. She had a key, apparently from a time the Andersons had trusted her enough to water their plants or watch their house. She glared at them, shoulders heaving. "David, we're leaving," she said in a clipped voice, turning to the boy who stood frozen in the hallway. Mrs. Anderson immediately placed herself between Wilson and David. "You can't just come in here," she snapped, her voice quivering. "We've called CPS and they're investigating." Wilson's jaw tightened. "He's my foster son, and I've done nothing wrong," she insisted. "You're all being dramatic. This is just some big misunderstanding." John stepped forward, phone in hand. "I'm calling Detective Harris," he warned. "Leave until we sort this out." In a flash of anger, Wilson lunged for David's arm. David yelped, fear flaring in his eyes. Mrs. Anderson tried to pull him away, but Wilson was stronger than her short stature implied. She yanked David toward the living room, where the small coffee table wobbled from the sudden movement. "Let him go," Mrs. Anderson shouted, voice high with panic. John struggled to dial Harris with shaking fingers, but Wilson had pinned David against the couch. David's breaths turned ragged, tears streaming as he tried to twist free. In the chaos, a neighbor who'd heard shouting dashed in, moments before Mrs. Anderson could fully intervene. With combined effort, they pried Wilson back. David crumpled to the floor, gasping. Wilson, chest heaving, realized what she'd done and staggered backward. The neighbor dialed 911, and a flurry of sirens arrived soon after. Detective Harris burst through the open door, taking in the overturned lamp, the trembling boy, and Wilson standing there, wide-eyed and disheveled. He signaled paramedics to tend to David, who was clutching his ribs, struggling to inhale. Mrs. Anderson knelt at David's side. "Deep breath, sweetie," she pleaded, tears in her eyes. But David's breaths were shallow, his face pale. The paramedics moved in swiftly, administering oxygen and checking for injuries. Harris approached Wilson, who stared at the paramedics with disbelief, as if only now realizing the seriousness of the situation. He cuffed her wrists gently, but without hesitation. "Jennifer Wilson, you're being detained," he stated, voice trembling with residual adrenaline. She opened her mouth, but no words came out. At that moment, the Andersons' front door threshold turned into a frenetic scene. Paramedics carefully lifting David onto a stretcher, neighbors whispering among themselves, and the flash of red and blue lights reflecting off the walls. Mrs. Anderson hovered close, wanting to accompany David, but the medics needed space. "You can follow in your car," one of them said gently. Mrs. Anderson nodded, tears dripping onto the hardwood floor. Her worst fears had just come true. David's fragile sense of safety was shattered, and he was hurt again. Outside, Harris guided Wilson into a squad car. She mumbled something about exaggeration and accidents, but the detective's stony silence said her excuses no longer mattered. As the ambulance pulled away, its siren blaring, only one question remained. Would David's injuries prove fatal? David Logan was rushed into the ER, paramedics calling out vital signs and concerns about possible internal injuries. His breathing was strained, chest rising and falling in shallow spurts. A flurry of medical staff guided the gurney through the hospital corridor. Mrs. Anderson, who had arrived moments later, paced in the waiting area, hands clasped as if in prayer. Detective Harris showed up within the hour, quietly speaking with doctors and nurses to gather preliminary observations. "He's stable for now," one doctor told him, "but we're seeing signs of compromised lung function, possibly from prolonged pressure on his torso." The phrase mechanical asphyxia cropped up, sending a chill through the detective. In a curtained-off section of the emergency ward, David drifted in and out of consciousness. An IV line snaked into his arm, and an oxygen mask clung to his face. Mrs. Anderson stood by, gently brushing hair from his forehead. She whispered reassurances, though her own eyes brimmed with worry. Meanwhile, Harris learned from the hospital staff that David had bruises across his rib cage, as well as older contusions on his arms, suggesting a pattern, not a one-time event. An officer arrived with forms from Child Protective Services. Legally, they needed to confirm David's status and ensure his foster mother, Jennifer Wilson, could not claim custody while an investigation was underway. Wilson herself was transported to the police station for booking. She insisted she hadn't intended to harm David, calling it a tragic misunderstanding. Yet every witness account and medical observation suggested otherwise. As day turned into night, David's condition seemed to stabilize marginally. Mrs. Anderson found a shred of hope in his slight improvement. He opened his eyes briefly, recognized her, and squeezed her hand. "You're safe now," she said, forcing a smile through tears. "We'll figure this out." Detective Harris, however, remained uneasy. Speaking with the ER physician, he learned how delicate David's state truly was. "He's young and resilient," the doctor admitted, "but if he has any complications, it could turn critical fast." The Andersons sat vigil, rotating by David's bedside. Occasionally, a nurse would usher them out so David could rest. Outside his room, Harris made phone calls to gather more evidence. A coroner's consult in case the unthinkable happened, statements from neighbors who had witnessed earlier incidents. As the second day dawned, David's lungs grew weaker. Machine alarms beeped more frequently, and a tense hush blanketed the pediatric ward. A specialist was called in, but the damage appeared more extensive than first thought. The repeated episodes of David being forcibly pinned seemed to have compounded the trauma to his torso and airways. By the afternoon, his oxygen levels plummeted. In a desperate attempt to save him, doctors rushed to intubate. Mrs. Anderson and John stood outside the partition, clinging to each other in tears. Harris lingered nearby, phone clenched in his hand, unable to tear his gaze away from the small figure fighting for breath. Tragically, David's body gave out. At 3:12 p.m., the medical team pronounced him deceased, citing mechanical asphyxia as the likely cause. Sobs echoed in the corridor. Mrs. Anderson collapsed into John's arms, and Harris felt a surge of anger at the system that had failed a terrified child. He silently vowed that Wilson would answer for every bruise, every tear, and every moment of fear that led to this final heartbeat.